episode of Detonation. We have Mr. Ben Sharp here with us, and he's a Bitcoin expert. He's an entrepreneur in the Bitcoin crypto space, and we're going to talk to him in a few seconds and ask him all the normal questions that we ask people around Detonation on what's on who and what and where and when and why and how and all those questions. But first, I just have to address something. The media has been calling me in regards to the Epstein thing. Epstein was a controversy that I was trying to ignore. Okay, I was trying to just ignore it because it was just another rich, evil person doing rich, evil things, and it's landed on my doorstep. And I've had some people calling me up asking me about it, and all I can say to those people is, listen, I have Gennady coming back on tomorrow, probably. But if not, there's a statement on the website to do with the party and to do with the association between Epstein and the Transhumanist Association. So you can find that on their website. Gennady has written up a strong statement on that. And apparently there's no connection. Okay? There's no connection there. And it doesn't stand for the values of that party. So we'll get more information on that, but if the media wants to keep calling and keep talking, I can give them advice, but I would direct them to the website in order to clear up some of those issues. And I'm not going to go into H+, Humanity Plus, and the 100,000 plus donations or anything like that. It's not my business, so don't ask me any more questions on that front. So in saying that, Ben, welcome to the show, Mr. Ben Sharp.
What's going on, Steele? Nice to have you. Nice to be on the show. Yeah, excited to talk about Bitcoin and see your thoughts on it.
Absolutely. So you're like going to be one of these new multi-millionaire crypto space people, right?
Oh, I don't know about that, but I'm just pretty interested in it. Been involved in the space for maybe 5 or so years now. Big Bitcoin advocate. Me and Steele were just talking before, not so much blockchain advocate. I think in this whole cryptocurrency ecosystem, that Bitcoin itself is the innovative application in the space, not so much blockchain. I think blockchain is just an aspect that makes Bitcoin work, but blockchain on its own doesn't offer much value, in my opinion, and that is evident in the way the market's going and the sentiment changing in the cryptocurrency space, with things going back to being more focused on Bitcoin as well. You see a lot of like influencers in the space and stuff like that switching back to being more Bitcoin focused rather than the cryptocurrencies, and a whole lot of other reasons that I'm sure we'll get into in this podcast.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, we'll get more into the show in a bit. So just tell people who you are and, you know, your history and your involvement with the Liberty Movement and all that other stuff.
Yeah, sure. So my involvement in so I've always been quite into tech. So, you know, since I was quite young, you know, computer science, things like that. I actually was more heavily involved in the biotechnology space when I was in my early 20s, late teens and things like that. Tried to do a few startups in that space, with fungus products. So that just means like gels and things like that can stop bleeding or clot blood. And then after that, I kind of started moving into Bitcoin because I met a few guys when I was at university who were quite involved in it. A good friend of mine was a core developer, so it was good to have that, you know, very, I guess, expert advice and opinions on Bitcoin rather than, you know, listening to what's going on in the market and seeing all the hype and stuff around cryptocurrencies. So had a very good, I guess, mentor to talk to me about Bitcoin, learn about Bitcoin. And then that journey started probably about, as I said earlier, 5 years ago or so. Since then, I attempted and then kind of failed to start up a peer-to-peer cryptocurrency exchange with a friend of mine for Monero, which is another cryptocurrency. It's a privacy-focused cryptocurrency. And that didn't work out. And not long after that, I was still quite heavily involved in the cryptocurrency space, so Bitcoin primarily, following what was going on, keeping up to date with all the new developments, following the markets, things like that. And that kind of led me into being a lot more interested in things like economics, particularly free market economics and stuff like that, because that was a big reason as to why Bitcoin and the whole cryptocurrency space came to fruition. Well, presumably anyways. So Satoshi Nakamoto, the guy who...
Are you Satoshi?
Bitcoin. Definitely not. So it came from a lot of strong ethos of free markets, libertarian kind of values and things like that. So that kind of led me into that field of thought and that those communities in Australia. And that's actually how I met Steele. So we met each other at a conference in Perth. So I think it was Liberty Week it was called, wasn't it?
Yeah, Liberty Fest, yeah.
Liberty Fest, sorry, yeah. So I've actually only been involved in the whole Liberty, I guess, area for maybe a year or so. So I'm still learning a lot in that regards, particularly around the economics and stuff of Bitcoin and free market capitalism and all that. But I've spent practically most of my time researching that side of things and how it applies to Bitcoin, which I'm sure me and Steele are also going to elaborate on in much more detail.
Absolutely.
In this podcast.
Yeah, so that's kind of what got me into the whole cryptocurrency thing as well. I was big into economics. I was exploring economics. You go into free market economics. What happens is one of the first things they start complaining about is the centralization of money, the central banks, the fact that there's no competitive currencies, the fact that it's all backed by something, whether that be gold or silver, built on the centralized network. And they're saying, hey, we need to be decentralized. Milton Friedman talked about this, which is the Friedman Corporates. I mean, he argued that the next step of the internet would be a peer-to-peer decentralized crypto coin or digital currency that would be outside of the realm of this centralized competitive system. The other thing is like the thing that free market people don't talk about, and a lot. And expanding on that point for just 2 seconds is a lot of these libertarian people who probably never would have heard of Bitcoin got into it really early because of that notion. So they probably weren't actually so interested in that. And then you go to these conferences and they were talking about the distributed ledger technology way back in 2012. So I got a double whammy on that, because I was a big fan of Max Kaiser, if you know that guy from RT, Jeff Berwick, all these guys. And so I got into that early off because of RT, and that was, thanks Max Kaiser on that, as an intellectual feat. But the liberty movement itself saw its opportunity to advance this cause as a crusade against central banking. There is one comment on that I want to get your opinion. So if everything is in a fluctuating competitive market, do you think that there's also a competitive market for these centralized economies, centralized currencies?
Yeah, well, definitely. Like, I'm a big fan of Friedrich Hayek's work on denationalization of currencies. So I think that is the way things are likely going to go. The current financial climate that's going on in the world with things like QE and negative interest rates. So, and with the whole LIVERA Facebook cryptocurrency coming up, like that's going to spawn a whole lot of other likely tech magnates making their own digital currencies. I wouldn't call them cryptocurrencies, but making their own digital currencies, which is going to create a lot of privately issued currencies, which may or may not, I don't know, it's a very speculative thing, make people stray away from fiat currencies and adopt a more decentralized, approach to currencies around the world. But I definitely see that's where things are going.
I call Libra the CIA coin. That's what I call it.
Yeah. It's like Libra is very interesting. Like it's something I haven't looked into in great detail, but I'm pretty skeptical that it's even going to get launched. It seems like it's getting. I watched a bit of the Senate hearing and stuff last week with it, and it seemed like it's getting a lot of criticism. There's a lot of Facebook execs even saying that they're quite pessimistic that they're actually going to go through with it. Have people at the Fed and the government as well help development, which it has to some capacity. I think they still are working on it, but I'm more optimistic that someone like Amazon or Google will launch a digital currency and they will get approval before Facebook. most likely, in saying that, is that's due to the current situation that Facebook's in with all its privacy allegations and all the stuff, all the mud it's been dragged through in the last year or so. I think that's a big reason it's getting all of this criticism for LIVERA, whereas Amazon and Google and stuff like that aren't really in the limelight. So I think there's a good chance they're going to come out of the woodworks quite soon and release their own digital currencies.
You refer there to Cambridge Analytica, which is what you're saying when you're talking about Facebook, because of election meddling. But there was also this Operation Veritas over at Google, which is exposed Google for trying to manipulate, or thinking about trying to manipulate, search results to help out their own candidates. Do you think that the Operation Veritas is big enough to derail a Google cryptocurrency?
Well, yeah, definitely. I don't think Veritas has been blown up to the magnitude of the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, but yes, definitely would be a hurdle that they have to get over. I think Amazon is the prime candidate for releasing a digital currency that gets widely adopted. I'm not exactly sure on the figures, but I think they have like 40% of the US retail market, so they could easily issue the Amazon coin and give rebates to people who use the Amazon coin over traditional money, which obviously that creates big incentives, and that's 40% of the whole retail market in the US, which is massive. So Amazon, in my opinion, is the prime candidate to have a good digital currency that gets adopted widely.
I think you're really smart in saying that, because Amazon is not seen as a sinister enterprise either. It's just a transaction of goods and services. So even if they did hoard data, the only data they're hoarding is how many cups someone's buying or how many drones are being bought or sold. I mean, it doesn't dig into people's privacy the way that Google and Facebook do. It just digs into sales, networking, and any credit card, anything like that, they can pass off as a PayPal problem or a banking problem or personal data. I mean, they don't. I agree with you on that. I think Amazon is the unseen behemoth.
Yeah, well, they pretty much already have all that financial data, anyways. Like, even though they don't. Own PayPal and a lot of their payment processes and stuff like that, like they have huge amounts of information on people's spending habits. So having a currency isn't really going to change that much. And the fact that they haven't really used that data in a lot of malicious ways, like Facebook and Google has with their data, that makes me relatively optimistic that maybe it'll be okay. I probably wouldn't use the Amazon coin personally, but I'm sure lots of people will if it gets released.
It's in this broader category of corporate coin, if you know what I mean. So decentralized Bitcoin we're talking about, or all these other tokens, or these coins. I mean, they're all built by individuals or groups or collective nerds, essentially, who built up these things. But now the in 2017, 2016, late 2016, all the smart money, so that's the JP Morgans, the Bank of Americas, the Commonwealth banks here in Australia, and they all started to move into cryptocurrencies internally within their own systems to reduce costs, to reduce transaction costs, even though they're going to stay on the centralized system, because that obviously that's a bigger market right there. So corporations are seeing it and they're saying, hey, if we're big enough, it's the rise of the corporate coin.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, you're just talking about this then. I was just reading the news before I came on the show. I think the Federal Reserve actually just announced that they're going to be issuing their own form of digital type currency by 2024, which I thought was funny, because 2024, in the crypto world, that's what, four years, almost 4.5 years away. Like, it's a long time to wait. Like, I'm sure by that time we'll probably have a tech giant that has a digital currency well ingrained in society, and the Federal Reserve coin's probably going to be useless by that point, or no one's going to use it. But yeah, it's funny that they.
But the thing is, they're banking on the fact that their balance book is so big that they have trillions and trillions of dollars worth of assets on their balance books, that it wouldn't matter, because even if that one did win, essentially they'd dump it onto that book and basically own whatever coin rose up in its place anyway. I mean, if it's the Fed we're talking about, it's backed by God knows what, the world's largest military complex.
Yeah, nothing really. It's not not ideal, but they're not very optimistic about that Federal Reserve coin. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a shit show. So excuse my French, but
French is fine.
Interesting stuff with LIVERA. I actually, with LIVERA, I do hope it goes through. Like what we were talking about just before. I want more competition in the currency markets. That shouldn't just have federally issued currencies. You should have private issued currencies. Whether there's centralized, decentralized, whatever. Like it's good to have options and alternatives and let the market decide what is the best form of money. In my opinion, it's it'd be cool if we went back to a gold standard, but I think Bitcoin is a better alternative to gold, mostly on the transportability side and a few other characteristics. But,
yeah, that's really interesting. And so let's go through some questions, because I know you're desperate to talk about this. So how does freedom tie in with Bitcoin and the wider blockchain ecosystem?
Well, I guess I'll start with Bitcoin, and then I can talk about the wider blockchain ecosystem. So I guess inherently Bitcoin was created as a tool for freedom in a lot of ways. Like you can't really pinpoint and say that it was created for that reason. Like as I was saying before, Satoshi Nakamoto didn't really express a lot of ideological reasoning behind his development of Bitcoin, but there was obviously things like posting the bank bailout title in the Times in the first ever Genesis block of Bitcoin. Some banks on the bailout of on the brink of bailout. Sorry, bit of a tongue twister with all the B's in there. So that was in the first Genesis box. So that is a big indication that the creation of Bitcoin was a response to bad monetary policy and fiscal policy, which led to things like the GFC. But Satoshi was he would have been working on Bitcoin well before the GFC occurred, and well before there was the notion that the GFC was going to occur. So obviously the people who worked on these problems, which going back in history a little bit before I get into this, cryptocurrencies or the technology behind them was getting worked on as far back as the 1980s. Since the internet was kind of born, the idea of a digital currency, like it's a pretty simple idea, was getting worked on. And there was papers published in 1991 of people trying to make different currencies. There was B-Money, eCash. There was several others over the years, and all of these kind of accumulated lots of research and work, which kind of inevitably led to Bitcoin. And Satoshi was just smart enough to combine all these people's research and add a few extra things. And it was kind of the blockchain, I guess, that blockchain technology that kind of sealed that deal that made Bitcoin work the way that it does in its decentralized way. But like going back before, what I was saying is how it's tied to the GFC and not trusting government and banks and things like that. Bitcoin is definitely tied to that ideology of distrust toward the banks, which I hold to some degree. I'm sure you do as well, Steele. But in that way, Bitcoin, I guess, is championed, especially in its early days, in like 2009, 2010, maybe up to about 2012. It was championed as this freedom money. I know Gab uses this. Gab's like an alternative social media platform to Twitter. They use a slogan, I think, say, Bitcoin is free speech money, because it's permissionless, so anyone can use it. There's no rules on who can't use it, who can use it. It's open, so anyone can actually contribute, be a part of the network in any capacity. They could be a miner and get involved in a more economic, financial level. They can just be a node operator and be altruistic and just operate the Bitcoin blockchain and contribute in that way. They can just be a user, which contributes to liquidity and things like that, and helps the market develop and grow. So everyone involved in it, everyone can be involved in it in any capacity, and no one can be told they can't be involved in it, which is great. So that ties in with all the libertarian philosophies and free market principles of classical liberal economics. As well as borderless, so there's no that's kind of ties in with what I was saying, permissionless, so anyone can use it anywhere in the world, which does give rise to a lot of criticisms of Bitcoin. You'll often hear people say, "Oh, we use for crime and this and that," and which is it's a hard argument to talk about, because obviously, fiat currency is used for crime as well. I would agree that things like Bitcoin would potentially make things like KYC, AML harder to comply with, as well as they may allow crime to occur a bit more often with financial instruments, like referring to money. But I don't think that's it's the best of two evils if you look at it. Like, say for example, like being pro-guns in America, like, you know, there's a lot of like freedoms that are tied to that, like Second Amendment, things like that. It's very ingrained in US culture as being a pivotal part of being a free US citizen. But in saying that, you know, obviously there's mass shootings and things like that occur, but like, it might sound taboo to say, but I guess they're trade-offs that you take to have those freedoms in society. There's always trade-offs. That's, you know, that's economics 101, and there's a lot of trade-offs when you're going with freedom-related tools like guns and decentralized money. So yeah, there will probably be a little bit increase in crime, but the benefits of the freedom that you get from using a digital currency like Bitcoin, I think, outweighs any potential increase in terrorism funding and things like that. But I don't even know. Like, that's a speculative argument. I don't know if it will happen like that, because there's a lot of companies that are popping up that are doing chain analysis and things like that, and Bitcoin, and tracking, you know, de-anonymizing people and tracking people's transactions through the network, which I don't particularly agree with. I'm a big privacy advocate. A lot of tech in Bitcoin that's being worked on to stop these companies from doing what they're doing. But it's a uphill battle all the time with privacy. It's never ending. It's a game of cat and mouse, as a lot of people would say. So, but yeah, all these things kind of tie into Bitcoin being a very free speech, freedom based money, and in a lot of ways, like, yeah, it definitely ties in with that. So then answers the question about Bitcoin anyways. I'll jump into, I guess, the wider blockchain thing. Personally, I don't think blockchain really enables more freedoms to be tapped into in many ways. Like, I'm quite a big Bitcoin blockchain skeptic. I think too many people are isolating blockchain as this technology that somehow miraculously gives immutability and security of data, which isn't the case at all. And people have that false assumption based on Bitcoin's success. But Bitcoin's successful not because of blockchain. Blockchain was just one piece of the puzzle that Satoshi kind of added to Bitcoin to make it work, which is like what I was talking about before, about all this research and all this developments that happened over the last 25, 30 years or so that led to Bitcoin. It was all those things, lots of different things. You know, you got proof of work, which solved the Byzantine generals' problem of coordinating information amongst non-trusting peers. You have the blockchain, which also kind of helped solve that, and also helped solve the double spend problem of when you've got a digital asset, you can replicate it as many times as you want. So you can double spend a digital currency if you don't have a good distributed, ledger that keeps track of who owns what, which is what the blockchain does. And then you have another very, I think, underrated aspects of Bitcoin. So I can't talk about blockchain, then we're back to Bitcoin. Another very underrated aspect of Bitcoin that I think was a big innovation of Satoshi was things like the hard cap limit, which might not sound that innovative, but it was in a lot of ways, which that kind of ties into like gold. And, next year, the Bitcoin rewards for miners actually halves, and that's going to increase the stock to flow ratio of Bitcoin to be actually higher than gold. I think gold's around 60 or so, and Bitcoin will be 65 or something. And then 4 years after that, it's actually going to be even higher. It'll be in the 100 range. So that's fantastic. So it's going to be the most, I guess, scarce but relatively stockpiled form of money that's ever existed. Way more scarce than gold, which is pretty exciting to say. That aspect of digital scarcity as well, that's something that Bitcoin, it didn't exist before Bitcoin. The idea of having scarce digital assets wasn't a thing. So that's another aspect to kind of look at when you're talking about these assets and why Bitcoin succeeded so well. I'll get back to the blockchain point in a second. And then the other thing that I think is quite underrated with Bitcoin is the difficulty adjustment rating when you're talking about mining with Bitcoin. So when more miners pile onto the network, so generally in economics, the price of something goes up, it's going to get produced more, which is going to kind of bring those prices down and reach this equilibrium in the market. Well, this difficulty rating, no matter how many miners jump on board and contribute processing power to the mining of these Bitcoins, the difficulty will always adjust and stay to the point where, on average, every 10 minutes, a Bitcoin block will be mined, which mints new Bitcoins and turns them into circulation, and they're awarded to the miners who use this processing power and electricity and stuff like that to solve these, trivial math problems. But that difficulty adjustment that the mining algorithm has in Bitcoin is quite interesting. It's something I've been very fascinated in from an economics perspective for the last 4 or so months. Not that long, but I've been reading into this in the other areas usually. But that difficulty adjustment period kind of creates a pretty game theoretically sound system that quite hard to game. You can't. It's not as affected by shifts in increases in prices, which is important for a new currency, actually a whole new asset class, because obviously it's going to be extremely volatile and it needs to find a price floor at some point in time. And having this difficulty adjustment is very important. It's not going to make it too volatile and kind of burst it in like this insane big bubble. So I think the difficulty adjustment is something that is very underlooked. But the reason I'm talking about all these points is when you have a lot of these blockchain focused projects, they get the blockchain idea and the technology, which is quite simple. All it is really it's a distributed database that's very slow and inefficient. Really, like if you want to put it in simple terms. And a lot of these blockchain companies look at the success of Bitcoin for all those reasons I just mentioned before, and they think they can just grab this blockchain technology because that's what they think is creating all these, network effects and increases in interest in Bitcoin and all the positives of Bitcoin, and grabbing this blockchain technology and trying to apply it to everything because they think somehow that this blockchain technology on its own just magically creates that system. But it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more facets. There's lots of different areas. Like I've got an article here because there's lots of different things you want to talk about when you're creating one of these systems, and you need to get all these right. And I think Bitcoin did, and it was a stroke of luck in some ways, but luckily it did. So you need to be, you need to have, if you're building a team anyways around a blockchain project, these are kind of all the pieces of the puzzles that you need to understand and have good knowledge of, and have really sound principles on. So you need to be focused on like networks, like game theory and mechanism design, which is what I was talking about before. Cryptography, obviously, proof of work, Byzantine fault tolerance. So that's a big argument in the crypto space or the blockchain space, is how to what consensus mechanisms to go with, whether proof of work's good or proof of stake, which we can talk about after this if you want. You need to have broad knowledge of social engineering, psychology. That also ties into like general, the economic principles behind these systems and the incentives and disincentives and how those kind of work in these networks. Obviously, computer science, decentralized and distributed computing, which is a huge area of computer science that really needs to be well understood. And that can go back to understanding things like IPFS and Tor and how they work. And Satoshi had a lot of knowledge actually in that area, and he understood the resilience that these distributed networks kind of can have, and he's seen that they could be applied with money. That kind of led to the invention of blockchain. And also economics, incentives, disincentives, and data structures such as blockchains and regular databases. So there's a lot of these are all kind of pieces of the puzzle that you need to kind of have, and I think you need all of them. You can't have half of them or even 99% of them. You need all of these facets to have this sound, distributed, censorship resistance, immutable, source of truth, which is some people use that term, but blockchains aren't truth machines in a lot of ways. And that's another thing we can touch on a bit later about tracking physical assets and real world products on blockchains. In my opinion, just doesn't work. And no one's actually done it effectively without adding layers of trust to the network. And as soon as you add layers of trust to a blockchain distributed, supposedly immutable, permissionless network, it defeats the point of using the blockchain. Once you've got trust, you may as well just use a centralized database and have a governing body dictate what goes on and what data gets put into that database. So I think that's one facet of the whole blockchain ecosystem of tracking things on the blockchain, whether it's art or shoes or any physical real world asset. I just don't think that works. And it doesn't work because of a problem called the Oracle problem. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I never heard that. The Oracle problem. That's the one thing I haven't heard of.
Yeah, so the Oracle problems, generally, it's an old age computer science problem. and it's where you, if you want to input data into, say, a database, and you want it to be trusted and verified and true, and it's coming from the real world, so you're having an input from the real world, you need to have an oracle. And the oracle problem is that you can't really 100% trust like that central oracle entity to be a source of truth, because, say, for example, like if you're having a price feed from the real world, say from the stock market, and that price feed's going into a blockchain distributed based system, who's the one who dictates that information that goes into that database? And that's generally where you would have an oracle. So you have your blockchain, you've got an oracle, and you've got the price feed. And there's lots and lots of people that are trying to solve this oracle problem with creating like distributed networks around that oracle, and you can have like wisdom of the crowds, and everyone kind of decides what's the truth, and they kind of input that. But that system can be gamed in a lot of ways, and you can play around with that, and it can be hacked, and a lot of issues in that regard. So it adds layers of trust is the kind of message we're trying to send across when you're dealing with these oracles. And I don't think you can solve the oracle problem. I think it's an unsolvable problem, even though there's multitudes of blockchain-based projects trying to solve it. I think it's kind of one of those impossible things that you can't really solve unless you had some omnipotent AI that was just all intelligent. But then again, like, who made that AI? Like, what data did that AI feed get fed into it? So that's also a layer of trust. And when you're talking about these distributed systems and things like Bitcoin and blockchain, you always hear the term trustless, because you want them to be trustless. You don't have to trust anyone. You don't have to trust central banks and stuff like that. That's a big ethos of why things like Bitcoin exist, these completely trustless networks. So when you get into this blockchain space, particularly when you're talking about like these tracking things on the blockchain and stuff like that, like IBM and a lot of big companies are jumping on board with this stuff. So it might sound like it's going places and it's got traction, but like, things like the oracle problem, they've been around for years. Like they're not things that you can just solve like that and chuck a token on top and make these little incentive mechanisms and get around these things. Like, no matter what, there's going to be layers of trust, and that just makes the whole point of using a blockchain redundant, in my opinion. And the reason that these big companies, I think, are jumping on board with all this blockchain technology is just purely out of hype. They want to look like they're innovative and with the times, and IBM's always been a very big, slow-moving company, and they want to look like they at the cutting edge of technology and working with blockchain and tracking whatever. I think they're tracking like lettuce or something, avocados in the blockchain. Like, it's silly. Like, you can't do that in a non-trustless way. You can, I guess. Like, I could be wrong in this regards. Like, currently, blockchain has been around for like 10 years now with Bitcoin, but I'd say the real advent of blockchain-based hype started in like 2014, 2015 with like the launch of Ethereum. So you got 6 or 7 years, and like, you can look it up. Like, none of these projects have really been fruitful. They haven't really created any real world value. If you look at Ethereum, the second biggest cryptocurrency, and you look which is known for building like decentralized applications on top of it, DApp usage, which you call a decentralized app, you call it a DApp. The DApp usage is almost non-existent, which is funny, because people think they're creating these big revolutionary dApps that are going to change the world, and they're building Ethereum, so they're secured by that base layer 1, and no one's using them because they don't work, in my opinion. And as much as there's all these advocates and people pushing the hype, I think the market's really, if you look into things like that, like the DApp usages, how many people are actually using these apps, I think that's a good indication of the market actually saying, no, like, this doesn't work that well. But I could be wrong in that regard. Maybe there's still just a lot of hiccups to get over, but at the moment, that's the sentiment. And I think Bitcoin is the only one that's really getting any traction and making waves, and is going to have big impacts in the future. So Bitcoin doesn't need it. Sorry for talking for so long.
No, you go on. Go on.
No, jump in.
So you mentioned a lot there, and the key point is it has to be trustless. If it's not trustless, I mean, what's the point? It has to be decentralized and trustless, and this is what you're saying. So I want to approach it like this because we've talked about a lot of stuff in there. Mr. Mises came on. His name isn't really Mr. Mises, but he uses it's a joke. He uses it as a pseudonym so he can come on the internet. And he said this, and I want you to respond to this. And he said that Bitcoin is the first app of blockchain. The email was like the first app of the internet, and Bitcoin is like the first app of blockchain. Does that make sense to you?
So yeah, that analogy pops up a lot, as well as the whole Facebook, Bitcoin's MySpace and Ethereum and all that other stuff. It's like Facebook, and they're like newer technologies. Like I'll disagree with that purely on the reason of what I was talking about before, about how Bitcoin is actually the big daddy of a lot of failed digital currencies that occurred between, say, 1985 to about 2008 when Bitcoin was made. So in my opinion, I would look at those projects, so like without talking about the like just blockchain itself. I think looking at just digital currencies broadly as a technology. I think the digital currency, that's the interesting technology, and I think blockchain is just something that makes that work. But I don't look at Bitcoin as like an old technology that Ethereum and that are going to surpass, because I look at Bitcoin as something that was in the making for a good 30 years. So in a lot of ways, Bitcoin was getting it made, or developed and worked on all the early ideas of Bitcoin when the internet first started, and it took I think 25 odd years to get to where Bitcoin is, with a lot of trial and error, a lot of companies that started around digital cash and e-cash, and there's a lot of prominent people who are in the Bitcoin community now who actually worked on these projects, like Nick Szabo and stuff like that. And I see that as like a accumulation of innovation over the years, and Bitcoin is that killer app. And then Ethereum and stuff like that, like kind of what I was saying before, like I think they have a wrong notion of what blockchains can offer. I think they think blockchain is a solution, where I think blockchain is just another form of a database that's actually quite slow and bad, that needs to be coupled with very good incentive mechanisms like Byzantine fault tolerance, things like that, like what I mentioned earlier. And say in the Ethereum community, like they disagree with things like proof of work being as a consensus mechanism for like miners. Whereas like proof of work was something that was trial and errored for 15 or so years. So like there was a lot of work that got put into that. And then Bitcoin was out for like, 4 years or so. And then they were like, okay, no, well, we've, crunched a few numbers over the last few years, done a bit of research. And they think that all of a sudden proof of stake is going to be a better alternative, a better way to do blockchain-based consensus, which is very contentious. Like no one's actually really trialed a proof of stake network at scale. So it's going to be interesting actually to see what happens when Ethereum transitions to proof of stake. But I guess to summarize kind of what I'm getting at is, no, I'd disagree with Mr. Mises. I would say that Bitcoin is the killer innovative app that has been worked on and innovated and reiterated for a long period of time. And all these new things are just copycats, or they misunderstand what Bitcoin is all about and how it actually works and why it's successful. So I reckon they will realize that over time, and I think they are realizing that now. Like at the start of the show, I said that the sentiment is actually changing. Like Bitcoin dominance is starting to grow. A lot of influencers, a lot of people who are involved in the technical side and the programming are switching to Bitcoin. Microsoft, for example, they're trying to build a just decentralized identity system on Bitcoin. A lot of other big companies are switching to using Bitcoin, and like there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the space. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things that happens in the other blockchain projects as well. It's hard to keep up with it all. It's like a full-time job almost. But I lost my train of thought there a bit. But
I'll boost you along. Well, you were talking about Microsoft. Does that help?
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying that the sentiment is changing around the whole crypto ecosystem. Things are starting to move back towards just pro Bitcoin, which they were prior to like 2017, 2016.
So the story was Bitcoin was the hype, then it fell away because everyone thought they knew everything they knew about blockchain, and now they realize they knew nothing, and they're all going back to Bitcoin.
Yeah, That's how I see it. So at the moment, anyway, is just being involved in the communities and stuff like that. But
I got to ask you.
Anecdotal.
I got to ask you. So it's not Bitcoin versus blockchain. That's a false fight. The real fight is Bitcoin versus some of its forks, like Bitcoin Gold or Bitcoin Cash. Is that the real fight?
Well, no, I like. Well, some people would say yes, but like of the people that on those other projects, but I don't think the other forks competing to be like a digital gold or a cash or going down that similar narrative of what Bitcoin's trying to do, like being a competitor to like central banks or however you want to look at it. There's lots of different narratives in this space. I don't think any of these forks like Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, they're the only two that I'd say really matter. I don't think they hold a candle to Bitcoin whatsoever. Like an example, I think that Bitcoin Cash has like 0.3% of the whole hashing power that Bitcoin has. The market cap's like significantly higher, like 10, 20 fold, probably more than that actually, off the top of my head. I don't think they compete whatsoever.
Roger Ver is never coming on my show then. He he won't want to.
Oh, you can get him on. I think Roger. I don't think Bitcoin Cash is a good project. I think it's crap. All the developers are jumping ship. There's no hashing power. It's very insecure on the mining level, so it's very open to 51% attacks, and that's going to get increasingly worse as the block reward halves, because you need to have some price increase whilst this block subsidies declining. Otherwise, it makes it a lot more easy to attack that network. And yeah, it's just a big shit. It's going to turn into a big shit show. But I do applaud like Roger Ver, because I think a lot of probably people in the Bitcoin community would disagree with me. I think he generally does believe in Bitcoin Cash, and you got to respect him for that. And he is a libertarian guy, so and he did do a lot of good for Bitcoin in the early days.
Absolutely,
I'll give him that.
Absolutely.
I definitely like. I'm not a big hater. Like, I would say people would say I'm like a big Bitcoin maximalist, which generally are known to be toxic people on the online communities. But I give merit where merit's due. I think that's a good principle to live by. I don't make fun of him and all that kind of stuff.
He's definitely one of the most controversial figures. Would you not agree?
Yeah, well, him and Craig Wright's
the
real controversial one.
I don't even talk about Craig Wright. Craig Wright's a loon. He's a loon. He thinks he's an idiot. He's an idiot. He's a loon. What is he in South America preaching to like indigenous tribes or something right now? I mean, he's a loon.
Oh, I don't know. He's always doing some crazy stuff. He's got all the Kleiman case in court going through at the moment as well, which is not going in his favour at all. He's trying to forge, legal documents that he gave to the judge. Everything he does is completely ridiculous. Like him and Calvin I are like.
He's a circus. He's like a traveling circus. Like, I'm glad he exists because he's funded. Like, he adds some comedy to the arena, but he's a loon. He's an absolute loon. Yeah.
I don't really get his motives, to be honest. Like, he's been involved in Bitcoin since such very early days. Like, I think there's a video of him circulating in like 2010 talking about how Bitcoin's going to change the world. He definitely was involved early days, and he knows a lot about it. And like, I presume he'd hold a lot of Bitcoin. So I don't know. I feel like he'd be incentivized to not try to attack the network, because I don't know. But I think genuinely he just wants to have a network that he has big sway over and controls. And but yeah, he's definitely not Satoshi. No fucking way. Like,
my knowledge of Bitcoin goes back to whenever Max Kaiser started talking about it in late 2010, because I was watching that show avidly, and then I was like, wow. Then he told me, and then I got into it then. So I don't know when I started, but I know I was watching the Kaiser report at that time, and that's when I was influenced by it. But we should have started with this first. But what is Bitcoin?
Well, I guess I've kind of touched on certain aspects of what it is, but in a nutshell, I guess it's a new form of money, in a sense. When I usually talk to people about like what is Bitcoin, I find it's easier to maybe start with talking about like what is money, because like Bitcoin is just being an alternative form of money, and the whole decentralized. It's decentralized and it's on a distributed ledger. No one controls it. And there's all that kind of good stuff to it, but in a basic sense, it's just it's a money. It's just non.
And it's still anonymous, I would add.
It's pseudonymous, like it's pseudonymous. So you can like some chain analysis companies have de-anonymized people and stuff like that because all the transactions are public, but the addresses aren't tied to an identity. So yeah,
Exactly,
synonymous.
yeah.
So yeah, which is good. Like, so I like the pseudonymy. I think you can be private if you want to put in the actual work and hide your tracks. But if you don't, which I don't know why you wouldn't, you can choose to be a bit more transparent. But yeah, like pretty much in a simple sense, it's money that's built on distributed ledger, which is blockchain. Has all those other nice recipes, pieces of the puzzle that I was talking about before, like proof of work, things like that. No one owns Bitcoin. No one like controls it. These are contentious things in some circles, but a lot of like Bitcoin Cash advocates and stuff, they would say that, you know, Bitcoin is controlled by Bitcoin Core, which isn't the case at all. Bitcoin Core is just a implementation of Bitcoin. It's actually separate from Bitcoin. The Bitcoin network exists on its own. It's a network similar to, if you think of Tor, like it's a network that exists. Bitcoin Core develops code and they changed certain aspects of Bitcoin, but no one has to run the code that Core pushes out. So that's where you have huge amounts of community influence, which a lot of people kind of think the community doesn't have big influence on the network, which I disagree with. And that there's evidence to say that that's the case, because like say the user activated soft fork back in 2017, I think it was, yeah, like 2017 or so, which was a soft fork pretty much means that people can opt into a certain added feature to Bitcoin instead of having to opt into it, like, so that makes the network unusable. And then another version, that's a hard fork, which means like everyone has to use this new updated piece of this new feature in the network, otherwise you can't use the network. So yeah, they did this soft fork and they pushed it out, and users decided they had a choice of what feature they wanted to go with. And there was huge community drive towards just plain SegWit, which was a type of way to make the, like, without getting into all the details, the technical details, just a way to make the transactions a bit more efficient. Also led to things like Lightning Network, which we can talk about, being able to be adopted. And the alternative to that was there was a bunch of large corporate entities involved in the Bitcoin space, like a lot of big companies that are still around today, like, you know, Coinbase and Zapo and stuff like that. And they pretty much were like, look, we're big companies. We're setting up this paperwork. It's called the New York Agreement. And they called it SegWit 2x, which was SegWit with an increased block size on the blockchain. So the blocks have certain data sizes. And that's another big contentious thing that's argued a lot on what's the best data size on a block in a blockchain. So these guys pretty much drafted up this agreement, and all these big companies around Bitcoin got together, and they were all going to sign off on it and say like, yep, we're going to change it. And they tried to do it, and it didn't go through because the community, there's such big community backlash, because the community was like, no, we want this. And ever since then, I think these big companies realized, oh, well, we actually can't have sway over over the Bitcoin network.
That was in New York, right?
Yeah, New York.
Yeah, I remember that. It was huge. Yeah, it was a huge, big deal.
Big thing. It was one of the really pivotal points in Bitcoin's history, because it showed that I guess it is relatively decentralized and community does have influence. And that's going to get increasingly so over time. Like, more and more people are going to get on board. There might be less people who are like for the cause and want to like run nodes and do all this kind of stuff. But the more people that get on board, and the more wide it gets adopted, if people are using that as their money, and I see in the news that like these people trying to influence and change things, it's cool that those people can have a say. So like every person almost acts as a individual, I wouldn't call them a central bank, but they're people that that each individual person, they can vote and almost act in like a democracy to decide what monetary policy Bitcoin is going to kind of go with, which is really cool. I think that's awesome. But so I got a bit of a tangent there of Bitcoin stuff, but Bitcoin is pretty much just, it's a decentralized distributed money. But to really like, I guess, understand like what that is, and before you get into all the details, because I found like over the years trying to like explain Bitcoin to people, if you just say Bitcoin's this, it's censorship resistant, it's permissionless, and you label off all the general like technical benefits, and you can compare it with gold. It's better than gold because of this reason, blah blah blah.
Transportability, fungibility, usability.
Yeah. Like you can lay off all these benefits of why Bitcoin's good on the very like superficial level. But to the general person, they don't really care about that kind of stuff. Like, you know, everyone just wants like, you know, like money. Like money to them is just this thing that they can buy stuff with, and that's as far as their thought goes with money. So I've kind of got to this point where whenever I talk to people about Bitcoin, I was actually going to start running workshops around this in Perth to educate people about it. I think it's always good to start with what is money and have a bit of a history lesson and go as far back as like, rice stones and how they were used by those ancient African tribes, and the beads that were used in Africa, and how the British came, and because it was such an easy to produce form of money, it was crap. So the British realized they could just inflate it and pretty much buy up all the land in Africa. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of money and where it went wrong.
American Civil War is a really good one with the tobacco industry. Tobacco as money. It's good. Yeah.
It's really interesting, like looking into money, because like it's something that's so ingrained and embedded into every aspect of human existence. Really, like transfer of value. Like it's pretty much just a transfer of information in a lot of ways. But no one really has a good grounding on what it is. Like it's still heavily debated in economics.
Academia
has been, but Austrian economics has very different views of what good hard sound money is compared to like Keynesian and more neoclassical economists and social economists. And like it's interesting. Like even to myself, like I've only been really diving down that. I first dived down more the technical rabbit hole of Bitcoin, and I'm now kind of diving into that more economic side of things. But you definitely need to know both. To really
we did the inverse. I got interested in the economics first, and then I from there it was a progression to competitive currencies. The internet. All right.
Well, that way that you went makes a lot more sense. Like I only got interested in the technical side because I was just broadly interested in tech. So I caught my interest, and I had my friend who educated me about it a lot. Like understanding the monetary side of it's really important. There's a good book by a guy called Saifedean Ammous. He's a big Bitcoin maximalist, called The Bitcoin Standard. I recommend like people checking it out. It's a pretty good read. There's some good criticisms online and stuff like that, so I wouldn't just take it as gospel. There's a lot of Bitcoin maximalists who do take it as gospel. I'm not one of them. I think it's a good book, Buck. It gives a history of money. It's a book about Bitcoin. There's only 10 or so chapters, and I think 7 chapters just talks about money. Doesn't even mention Bitcoin really, and then the last 3 chapters talk about Bitcoin, which I think is like that's the same narrative that I was slowly evolving to when I started talking to people about Bitcoin. So that's why I like the book. It actually resonated with the way that I try to communicate Bitcoin to people. And it's from a very Saifedean Ammous is an Austrian economist, so which is not many of them around these days. So he's probably the go-to guy for Bitcoin Austrian theory, and he talks a lot about what I was talking about earlier, like the stock to flow ratio, and all that is pretty much is how much of it something exists compared to how much gets added into the economy every year. So gold's a perfect example. The reason gold's such a good hard sound money, well, according to Austrians anyways, Keynesians don't really think that, is that it has such a high stock to flow ratio. And it's only got such a high stock because it's had thousands of years of accumulation. Because some people make the wrong assumption and they say that gold's valuable because it's scarce, which is true in some sense, but why, if you go with that argument, there's things like palladium and stuff like that, other rare earth minerals that are much rarer than gold, and why aren't they good hard sound monies based on Austrian theories of stock to flow and salableness and things like that? And that's because they don't have high stock. And if you tried to increase the stock, if you tried to introduce palladium as money in an economy, that would create big incentives to produce it, which would make producers probably flood the market with it, which would inflate this brand new currency, which would make it never even come to fruition, and it would never exist. So scarcity is not really the selling point of gold. It's the stock to flow, which in that book, going back to that book, he talks about that a lot, which is very interesting.
James Rickards, who's basically a CIA insider / lawyer, he would agree with you on this. He writes about this in his books Road to Ruin and Gold Money and a bunch of other books all the time, and he talks about stock to flow ratio. And yeah, essentially there's like it wouldn't make sense if it wasn't stock to flow, because otherwise people wouldn't clip the coins back in Rome.
Yep.
You see what I mean? There's it wouldn't make sense. But that's what they do. We'll get into scarcity stuff when we talk about Bitcoin mining in a second. But you mentioned Austrian economics. Actually, we'll leave that. We'll go. What is a blockchain first? What is the blockchain? So we've talked about Bitcoin, and what is blockchain?
Yeah, there was a few things I left out with the Bitcoin thing. But
Oh, go finish a Bitcoin example.
Well, I'll go on with the blockchain thing, because the blockchain thing I can tie that in with adding some stuff to what I was talking about, what Bitcoin is. So like all the blockchain is, like it's really simple. Like people blow it up like it's this complicated thing. It's a database for one. It's just a way of storing data that I guess people kind of twisted it and they warped it around in their own kind of ways. But it's a way to, I guess, store data in a distributed way that chronologically appends blocks in order. So all the data is in chronological order and it appends blocks in these time frames. And there's different mechanisms you can go about how those blocks are appended and how often they're added. And these are all these kind of arguments that the cryptocurrency ecosystem is trying to iron out and see which is the best, and the market is kind of deciding which is the best out of those at the moment. But yeah, all it really is another database that is generally deployed in a distributed way. There is a lot of people who don't deploy it in a distributed way, and they say it's distributed, but that defeats the point, because the only reason you want like chronologically ordered data is you want that immutability, so you can't go back and reverse those previous blocks that were added in the past. Because the way a blockchain works is it's pretty much a chain of hashes. So I don't know if your viewers would be familiar with like Merkle trees and stuff like that, but in a simple sense, they're pretty much hashes of hashes, and like all the hashes is a one-way function. It's like you input some data and you get this string of information, and you'll only be able to get that string of information based on that exact same data input, and that's an irreversible mathematical function that you can't change. So all the blockchain is just a big string of hashes that you get each block. So when you append one block onto the end of the blockchain in this chronological order, all you're doing is you're taking a hash of the previous block, and that previous block has a hash of the previous block. So you've got this big chronological order of hashes. And what I was saying before with hashes, if you change the data in any way, you get a completely different output. So if you go have your blockchain and you say this is the current time, this is 10 years ago when Bitcoin first started. If you went back in time and tried to change that database entry in 2010 for like Satoshi's first ever Bitcoins that were mined, it would completely change the whole Merkle tree hashes of that blockchain, which would invalidate everything. So you can't go back and change that. And the only way you can go back and change that, well, in Bitcoin anyways, with proof of work, is you need to apply all the processing power that was applied to make all those blocks. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we chat about mining. So it's economically infeasible if you want to go back in time and try to reverse blocks, because you need to apply an insane amount of processing power. And in a lot of ways, like even if you do that, like it's called a 51% attack if the miners get 51% of the hashing power, and they can start to presumably double spend transactions on the network. A lot of people talk about it like it's this big boogeyman, but it is bad. But all they can really do is double spend their own Bitcoins. They can't really change other people's, like steal other people's Bitcoins. Or the biggest thing is they can't change the consensus rules. So they can't change the hard cap of the Bitcoin network at 21 million. They can't change the proof of work algorithm. So that's just a quick note on 51% attacks that I think are a bit overblown, but they're still a problem. And that is becoming less of a problem actually over time, because there's a lot of work being done on making mining more distributed, because at the moment it is relatively centralized in China. So the Bitcoin uses proof of work to append these new blocks onto these blockchains. That's just one of many mechanisms you can use to append these blocks. There's, I guess, a lot of people refer to these things these days as distributed ledger technologies as well, which is what LIVERA is using, like we were talking about earlier. LIVERA, the Facebook cryptocurrency, or not cryptocurrency, sorry, or digital currency.
Proposed currency.
Technocurrency or whatever you want to call it. They don't use a blockchain at all. Like they use a form of distributed ledger, and you have all these peers around the world, and they kind of just come to this global consensus of what is the correct data on that input, which I guess in some sense can work within a contained system. But it doesn't have all the benefits that blockchain really offers of like things like censorship resistance and immutability and permissionlessness. Because like if you don't have those things, like you don't really need a blockchain. And I guess that's why Facebook actually didn't really go with the same model as like Bitcoin and stuff like that. But Facebook will probably work, but it won't be. It's not a competitor with Bitcoin. Sorry to get in a bit of a tangent there again as well, but the Facebook cryptocurrency is not a competitor with Bitcoin like whatsoever. Like it doesn't have the permissionless and the immutability and the censorship resistance that Bitcoin offers, which you need for a really good hard sound money. Like I could see a future where there's all these techno digital currencies like Amazon and Facebook and Google, and they're all backed by Bitcoin in a Bitcoin standard type thing, similar to like the gold standard that existed previously in the 19th century, which would be cool because that would work because the Bitcoin is auditable, no one owns it. I guess the cryptocurrency, the techno giants would probably have big reserves of Bitcoin, and I guess they would control that. But those reserves are auditable. People can verify them. They can check them on the blockchain. They can see that they're not doing stuff that the Federal Reserve does, like issue way more currency than actually exists. There'll be a lot more checks and balances in place if you use Bitcoin in that manner and you had all these digital currencies. And as well, because the digital currencies would be in a free market type system, they would have incentives not to have reckless monetary policy and completely destroy their currencies. And people would just jump on another currency if they did so, which we don't really have the option to at the moment, which sucks. If our governments start, manipulating our currencies and stuffing around with them. But did that kind of give you an answer of what blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a chronological ledger that spans space and time that is all verified by all other computers, and without that consensus, you can't analyze transactions.
Yeah, and it should be deployed in a distributed way. That's the main benefit of a blockchain. Otherwise, you may as well use a centralized database. And he's saying that just the distributed way, like anyone can run like a Bitcoin node. Like I've got like a couple nodes running, like on my computer. I've got some proprietary, like just hardware nodes on some Raspberry Pis and stuff like that. So anyone can run a copy of this blockchain node, and that's good because it makes the network more resilient to attack. Like it's hard to DOS a network, like denial of service. You
mentioned Tor is the same.
Yep.
If you don't run Tor, then the network starts to collapse.
Yep. See, Tor's a good example. Tor uses a lot of similar infrastructure to like Bitcoin and how it acts and it's distributed. It's got the nodes and they run the network. And just a quick note on Tor, something that's interesting about like, all this blockchain space stuff. So Tor's a great network. It's quite resilient. It's stood the test of time to some degree. It's obviously been issues here and there, but there always will be with privacy and security-based things. It's always an uphill battle. But when you're looking at all these blockchain projects and they got these tokens, they're trying to create all these complex incentive and disincentive mechanisms and all these complicated designs and try these new consensus things like proof of stake and proof of authority or whatever they're trying to do. If you just look at things like Tor has created a resilient distributed network with practically no economic incentives, no token-based stuff, and like it's a hard argument to put because it does come a lot down to altruistic and people like me and you who really believe in things like liberty, and we're happy to run like a Tor node or a Bitcoin node purely based out of ideology. But a lot of people, like especially like a lot of people in like say Bitcoin Cash community who I guess come from this real neoclassical economics perspective, and they think because there's no incentives there in place that no one's going to do it, which like I disagree with. Like look at like Linux, for example. Linux runs like the world, and it's practically operated by altruistic developers who do it out of own self-interest.
They don't see altruism as an incentive. Everything has to be price mechanism. Everything has to be on a sort of centralized platform of prices.
Which might be very like very like economics 101 might sound wrong to disagree with that, but I do to some degree. And
It's because neoclassical economics is built around GDP. That's why it's an old-fashioned set of rules that only talks about GDP. If I had you on, I was like, all right, let's talk about GDP, let's talk about the Dow, let's talk about the markets, because they're an aggregate of the data of the economy that's happening. But these like things like Tor. That doesn't have its own market space. You can't trade on Tor. The value is derived from the fact that WikiLeaks gets to function or something.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's other more abstracted incentives involved in these systems that are pretty hard to model
and the other thing is they don't see the hidden power. For example, who's to say that Donald Trump isn't a massive investor in the Tor network or something like that, helping WikiLeaks, because that would help him defeat Hillary Clinton, even for a temporary basis. Yeah. People don't look into this stuff as an incentive network. If you can't buy it on Amazon, then it doesn't exist in their world.
It's definitely completely agree. It's an interesting thing to look into, and like Linux as well is another good example, something like that, and Bitcoin is as well. Right? People always like, oh, well, how do people manage this network? How do they add new features to it? And a lot of the developers are paid at the moment by certain companies, but I don't think these companies really have much sway over what these developers do. They just the companies have investments in Bitcoin, so they have an incentive to make sure these developers keep developing Bitcoin, so they pay them to keep developing. So there's those things there, like similar to like that happens in Tor and like Linux and stuff as well. But these like natural incentive kind of schemes pop up over time as these networks kind of grow. But it's like that's one of my big criticisms with like this whole blockchain thing is they try to create these very complex incentive systems that are just convoluted. They create these projects and they call them utility tokens, and in a lot of ways they actually make the application harder to use, because then you have to go specifically buy their token to use their platform, which no one wants to do that. Like people want plug and play, simple, easy to use things. Like I know you've used many like dApps and tokens and things like that, but like coming from like a relatively technical background, I even don't enjoy using a lot of them. It's quite crap. Like even Bitcoin's good. Bitcoin's pretty cluggy and stuff at the moment, and that's kind of getting ironed out at the moment. And that's why the market's still very speculative as well, because there isn't like a lot of use case there for it. It's a lot of stuff to get worked out still. We're still looking at like 10 plus years, in my opinion, before Bitcoin becomes really prominent in society. But
and the government's very distrustful, so it's hard to, in Australia, it's hard to open an account, especially a long time ago. Because they try and make you scared, so they try and run you through these sort of centralized corporations, I guess. They definitely are. Like it's a competitive, which is stupid. That should be like illegal against like antitrust laws, really. Like I know there's no. Well, I know. For example, like in 2016, they were asking for your photo. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I mean, you had to send in a picture of you like a criminal with your photo, right? Yeah, you still do on pretty much all cryptocurrency exchanges. But that's not really the government. That's more the cryptocurrency exchanges being scared of the government. Yeah, and also Mt. Gox, right? Because Mt. Gox really gave everybody a bad rap 2013, 2014. Bitcoin could be a lot further ahead if it wasn't for Mt. Gox. Yep, 100%. Definitely. Mt. Gox is a big hiccup in the Bitcoin timeline. Like something interesting then, just going back in the history of Bitcoin that's popped into my head as well, and a big reason as to why I think this blockchain hype started and people didn't focus on Bitcoin much is its heavy adoption of like darknet markets, like drugs and stuff like that in its early days. Because that's the Silk Road and like Silk Road and Alpha Bay and all those darknet markets. Like that was a good testing ground for Bitcoin. It showed that it worked in a lot of ways. It showed that it was censorship resistant and private and all these kinds of things. But I think that narrative, because around 2014 or so is when all these big corporates started jumping aboard, like blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, where it's at. I think a big reason they did that, I reckon a lot of them actually probably thought that Bitcoin was great and it was good, and I think they just didn't want to associate themselves with something that was primarily used on drug markets, which I can't blame them for that really in a lot of ways. So I think that was a big reason that caused this hype. And I think now that all that drug stuff is kind of blown over, maybe that's a reason
as to what I was saying earlier about the sentiment around Bitcoin, going back to Bitcoin in this crypto space, because it's kind of moved on from that childhood, adolescent stage of being known as some drug, shady cryptocurrency that people use to buy guns and drugs and whatever else they get on those markets. So yeah, but that's just something that popped into my head that I thought I would add quickly about the
yeah. So Matt Gox, Silk Road, Kim.com, that's the big ones.
yeah.
You
all
know,
big events.
Yeah, all big events. So yeah, let's talk about very quickly, what is decentralization? Why is decentralization important compared to centralization?
Well, I guess you could give a simple or a complex answer to that question. Decentralization to some is because it's hard to really pinpoint. It's one of those measures you can't really get a stick and say how much decentralization is decentralized. It's not really something you can kind of dictate. The way I would look at it, and I got in a disagreement with some guy a while ago about this actually, and I said, because decentralization is purely based on the premise of you're trying to prevent a certain attacker from, influencing your network, or you're doing something malicious to whatever kind of you're trying to decentralize. And I'm of the view that decentralization is measured based on relativity, based on the attackers that are trying to disrupt the network, which to me made a lot of sense, but some people seem to disagree with me on that. I'm not exactly sure why. But it's relative, because it's like security, it's relative. Like if you've got, say for example, if you're building some small network and you're competing against the government, and the government's the ones who are attacking you in your tiny little network, they're going to just squash you because they've got the resources to. But if you're a massive network, like where Bitcoin is getting to that point, there isn't many contenders to shut them down. Like the government, maybe they have the resources and the power and the influence, but it's a relative thing. But decentralized in a sense is just practically what I guess the kind of word means. It's a network that's distributed amongst lots of different peers, and they all kind of, I guess, cooperatively make the network run, but no individual centralized body operates the network or that market or whatever kind of thing you're talking about. Whereas centralization is like a good way, like I'm sure your listeners like quite, economic literate, not illiterate. Like socialism is a centralized based system, whereas classical liberal ideas and like free market economics is a decentralized system. So the decision making is based on the individual, and the individuals, like what I'm saying, they're the nodes. They're the ones that operate and make decisions and distribute information amongst the system. And whereas socialism had this central body, and they all decide how the economy should work and where a resource should be allocated and stuff like that.
So if everything's decentralized, then obviously the mining would be decentralized too. So what is Bitcoin mining, this decentralized mining network? Why do they call it mining? What is the 21 million number? Why is it limited? Why is it scarce? And why does it consume so much power?
It uses a lot of power, yeah. Also, so Bitcoin mining at the moment, currently on Bitcoin mining, it's not that decentralized. Decentralized in the sense that no one operator has more than 51%, but people say it's not decentralized because I think somewhere in the range of 70% of all mining power is in China. So geographically, it's not distributed. So it's not that essential. This is where you get into what we're saying with the decentralized thing. It's kind of relative on how you're talking in the context. So with decentralization, when you're talking about mining, you want the mining to be distributed amongst geographic regions. So no one government can just shut down that whole industry in that region, as well as you want within those regions to have multiple different players who are all contributing to this mining. So you have different companies competing instead of just having like one company in each country, or the current situation with a few companies owning all the hashing power in China. Like in a lot of ways, that means the Chinese government could step in and potentially have big sway over the network, which probably wouldn't happen because there is a lot of incentive. If they did do that, the mining would probably just pop up somewhere else in another country, and because there's incentives there. Because the price, I don't know if the price would just drop that much if that happened. Like it probably happens slowly, so people would probably start shifting their mining operations to other countries that are less likely to step in, which would increase the price of mining, because the reason it's congregated in China is because electricity is so cheap. So mining is always going to congregate where electricity is cheapest. And what mining pretty much is it's in Bitcoin's case anyways, there's a lot of other projects that do things in different ways, it's a bunch of computers all trying to crack this very trivial math problem. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to find, so they get all the data in the block, so you have like things like block headers, your block data, which is the transactions that are held in the block. The miners are the ones who include those transactions into those blocks, and they do that based on how much fees people pay. So when you send a Bitcoin transaction, you can set how much you want to pay as a fee, and that's just like fractions of a Bitcoin. And you can fractionalize Bitcoin down to 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, so it's a lot. And miners, based on how much fees people pay, include these transactions into these blocks. And if you pay a higher fee, you're more likely to get included in the next block. If you pay a low fee, you might have to wait a few blocks. And blocks on average get appended onto the Bitcoin blockchain every 10 minutes. So if you have like a really low fee, you might have to wait for like 6 blocks before your transaction gets included in a block, which is just like, 60-minute wait or something. But if you pay a higher fee, it'll probably get included in the next block in like 10 minutes or so, and the transaction will get verified and then distributed to the network. But yeah, what these miners, their primary role is doing the mining, the hashing, which is solving that trivial math problem by solving this hash and getting like an X amount of zeros, which they kind of compute by adding a nonce, which is just a number. And that kind of, I guess, I'm not an expert on mining algorithms, by the way, so it's probably why I'm jumping around a bit. And they're trying to get an X amount of zeros in this big hash. So they're quite large, these hashes, and I think they actually have multiple hashes now because they got to this point where there's too many zeros and it's pretty much becoming all zeros. These zeros, each zero you add onto this hash that's required, increases the difficulty of how hard the hash that they need to compute using that nonce and all the data from the previous block increases. And that's what I was talking before about this difficulty rating. So as more miners jump onto the network, the more zeros that are required in this nonce to satisfy the requirements of the network and the mining algorithm increases. And each zero you add like exponentially increases, I think something like 16 times. So it gets exponentially harder as time goes on, as more miners jump on board. At the moment, I think it's like, the difficulty rate is extremely high. I think it's somewhere like you need to process like 70 quintillion hashes a second or something ridiculous like that. So it's insanely high numbers of like mathematical operations going on in these miners currently, and that will grow later. So that's the first kind of thing that miners do, is they process these transactions, and when they achieve this hash with this required amount of zeros using a nonce, which is just a random number. They choose the numbers. They can start or end their numbers whenever they want. They can pick random numbers. When they achieve this required hash, what it does is it mints blockchain Bitcoins for one. So the network will create Bitcoins and award that miner. So award that miner for the work that he put in. That's why you call it proof of work, because they're putting like computing power and processing power and stuff like that into the network to create these Bitcoins. And at the moment, they get about 12.5 Bitcoins for mining a block. So every 10 minutes, 12.5 Bitcoins are issued into the network currently at the moment. Second thing that miners do outside of contributing to processing power and doing the mining, that's what you call the mining, that aspect that I talked about just then. Secondly, they include transactions in the blocks, which are prioritized by how much fees people pay. So it's like an economic incentive to, prioritize certain transactions over others. Like say, if you want to get a transaction to go through faster, you'll pay a bit more. Obviously, if you're just buying coffee, you don't want to pay a high transaction fee, so you pay less, which might take long to process, which is actually a big reason Bitcoin Cash exists, and it's a big problem with Bitcoin. Well, it's not really a big problem, it's a feature really. It's kind of by design, which we can talk about after the mining topic if you want. And then lastly, miners, this is a bit of a contentious thing, but miners act as economic nodes in the network. So they're nodes that are contributing economically, so they all run nodes and act as holders of the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, and keep that database up to date. And this is where you get Bitcoin SV, Bitcoin Cash. or Bitcoin SV mostly, they think economic nodes are all that matters and not just listening nodes. So listening nodes are just like, if I just run a node at home, I can run a node and not mine. So I'm not actually putting work in the network and contributing to the whole game theoretical side of it because I'm not mining. But I am storing a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain, and Bitcoin SV would argue that people in that community would argue that what I'm doing doesn't really help make the network resilient at all. Whereas Bitcoiners would disagree, and they think everyone should run a node because it helps distribute the network, it creates more copies of the Bitcoin blockchain around the world, and people don't have to upgrade their software if they don't want to. And that's when you go back to what we're talking about, that user activated soft fork and the New York agreement thing, and how the community had big influence, and the individuals like me and people who run these nodes do have a say, whereas like Bitcoin SV would say they don't. So it's an interesting thing. Like, it's an argument that hasn't really been ironed out, and it's kind of a, like, no one's really right, which is that's an interesting thing about a lot of stuff I'm talking about today. Like no one really has an answer, because this stuff's all so new. Like, Bitcoin's been around for 10 years. This technology's so new. This whole way of just having an asset that's decentralized and completely like in the free market, that's privately issued, especially a currency, is so new and trivial. Like, no one really knows what's going to happen. Like, and I don't even know either. Like, I've got my inclinations of I think what's going to happen based on what I know about this space, but I could be wrong, and the other guys could be wrong. But we all could be wrong. Who knows?
So you mentioned that smaller transactions take more processing. Explain that.
So they don't take more processing. They take longer to get processed. So
right. Sorry.
When
yeah.
you
so the time
broadcast a
expanded.
transaction. Yeah. So when you do it, say you get your phone and you say you want to send Bitcoin to someone, what it does is it signs the how much Bitcoin you want with your private key, which is your key, which pretty much gives you access to your Bitcoin, and then you broadcast it to the network. And all these nodes around the network, they store these transactions in a thing called the mempool. It's pretty much just like a waiting list where you're waiting for your transactions to go through, and the miners are deciding which transactions to put in based on how much fees everyone's paying. So if you don't pay much fees, you will probably get, you might have to wait like 60 minutes or an hour. It depends on how busy the network is as well. That's why you can go on certain websites and you can see like best times of the day to send a cheap transaction because there's less people using the network and things like that. Like I don't know, for some reason Sundays are really good days to send cheap transactions, whereas like, I don't know, like Friday afternoon, for some reason the network gets a bit more congested and there's a bit more transactions going through, so the average fee goes up because people start paying a bit more because they want to get stuff through. But a big thing on that is the fee thing is because the blocks size for Bitcoin is quite small. It's only 1 megabyte, so it can hold like I think like 12,000 odd transactions or something. So like the transaction per second is quite small. It's like 7 transactions per second. It's quite minimal. You can't do that many transactions per second. So it definitely hurts the notion of the aspect of money being a medium of exchange. Bitcoin in its current state can't really facilitate being a medium of exchange, particularly for low retail commerce, because you can't go buy coffee with something, because generally the average transaction fee for Bitcoin will be about 50 cents. You can pay less, but it'll probably take long. And you can't go get a coffee and then be like, oh, I got to wait for my Bitcoin transaction to get verified, so I'm gonna have to sit here for like 30 minutes because I paid a low fee. Because if they pay a high fee, you'll be paying like 50% of the price of the coffee in the fee. So it just doesn't make economic sense. But there's work being done on second layers for things built on top of Bitcoin, something called the Lightning Network, that is trying to solve that issue. So make things like micropayments and stuff like that more feasible. But that's where Bitcoin Cash kind of divides. That's where you got Bitcoin Cash, is they think that Bitcoin was made to be this medium exchange straight away, this peer-to-peer cash, which in some sense it was, but that's very contentious because Satoshi was had lots of different views on things. Like, he called it digital gold sometimes, he called it peer-to-peer cash sometimes. Yeah, people look at Satoshi's words like gospel, which I don't particularly go down that narrative. But from an economic perspective, I think I've talked to some Austrian people and some other more neoclassical people about this, and everyone seems to have different views. But I think with a money, I think it should be a store of value first. Well, it gets to this point where it reaches a store of value when it kind of gets a price floor in the market, and at the same time it becomes a medium of exchange. But I think it becomes a store of value first, and then a few seconds after, it's at the stage where it can be used as a medium of exchange. Like gold's a good example of that. Like gold was, stored as like a shiny precious metal, like it was valuable, stored value, and for thousands of years it was known as that. And then when you get a bit more, starting to get more modern, you get more technology, it started getting used as coins, and that's where the more medium exchange value proposition of it came out. Gold previously to that was used as a medium exchange for more high retail stuff, but it wasn't something you'd go like, say back in, pre BC times, you wouldn't go buy like bushels of wheat with a few gold bars or something. It was used more like buying land and things like that, which you can do with Bitcoin at the moment. That's why I think Bitcoin's, the digital gold narrative makes a lot of sense, because at the moment, because the fees are kind of high, like they're like $4 or $5, but they're fixed at that. It's economical to buy like a car with Bitcoin. Like,
yeah.
And
there's been plenty of transactions here in Australia. Even a house in far north Queensland got sold for Bitcoin. And that's based off this factor. Okay, the micropayments suck in terms of the fees and the wait time, but for larger payments, everyone's competing over it. It'll be done in a few seconds, and they get $5.
Yep, yeah, and it's like a $5 transaction fee for $1 million.
Which is better than a couple of percent
transfer.
at any bank, and plus fees and taxes and capital gains and everything else that I mean, not capital gains, but everything else that goes with buying a $500,000 house.
And all the unnecessary taxes you have to pay is stupid. It's ridiculous. But yeah, like that's a thing that, to me, Bitcoin, that's by design. Like it's going to be like that. It'll be a store of value. Maybe in like 10, 20 years, it will the volatility has been on a very gradual, like very significant decline since it started, and it will continue to do so.
Hypothetically, if Satoshi's Bitcoin Gold was true, does that mean Litecoin is silver? Digital silver?
Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. I don't think Litecoin really has a use case. Like, it probably might piss some people off if you hold it, but I don't really know why Litecoin exists. Like silver has silver's only really, like, silver died as a money a long time ago, for one. It only really exists still because it's got utility in the market for certain goods. I guess.
Well, it's big in electronics. It's big in electronics, so
yeah,
it's a normal commodity now. Like fuel is good in cars.
Yeah, like when you're talking about Bitcoin and these digital currencies, they don't have real world utility. They're not capital goods. They're monetary goods, and that's it. So yeah.
There you go. Mike Maloney's not coming on the show either. He's going to kill me as well.
Why is that? No,
just having a go at silver. That's all.
Oh yeah, well, silver's good. Like it's got utility, but it's not like money. It doesn't have good monetary properties. Its stock to flow is quite low. In saying that, it does have decent monetary properties, but they're not as good as gold. And generally, people this is going back to like Menger and Mises and stuff have talked about this, and people generally converge around the most widely accepted medium of exchange or money, because it just makes the most economical sense. Like, people would rather just use one form of money instead of having to jump around, because it just makes commerce a lot more complicated and stuff like that. So that's a big reason like silver never stuck around as being on money, because people just converge to gold because it was so much better. And I think Bitcoin is just the gold, and because Litecoin has no utility value, it's just a monetary good. I don't see Litecoin really having a future at all. I think it will just kind of get eaten up by Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will just become the most widely accepted digital decentralized.
But it's not. Currency. But you're not arguing that Bitcoin will become a monopoly, or are you?
No. Oh well, it won't be a monopoly in a sense of how you look at it, like some corporatism type thing. But I think it will definitely be the monopoly within that kind of niche of decentralized store of value, money, medium exchange, maybe unit of account. I think Bitcoin will dominate that little niche.
The central bank of all central banks.
Yeah, but it's not issuing any money. It doesn't have any money. It doesn't have any artificial monetary policy. And I think that there will be a lot of competition in the like the tech digital currencies like Facebook and LIVERA and Amazon and stuff like that. And that will be good, and that will all be there. But Bitcoin will be the granddaddy of store of value monies. But it's good because it's decentralized. Like, I don't
So
think really
while we're talking about this, and Manga and Mises and all these other Austrians, how does Austrian economics tie in with Bitcoin? I mean, how does it all work? Like,
Well, like going back to like you know Carl Menger and like his principles of economics, like in his section on origins of money, his characteristics that he outlines as a good money, like pretty much summarizing it, is salableness, and how that's pretty much just goes into the basic properties of why gold's good. Like it's non-tarnishable, it stores value over time, and it's commonly accepted by a wide range of people, things like that. These ideas that Menger talked about, like Bitcoin has these properties, same as gold. And that's why, like when you talk about a lot of Austrian economists, say, or people who are into that kind of field of thought, they're always often very gold bugs for the exact same reasons that Menger pointed out. What is a hard, sound money? What good monetary policy is, which is pretty much no monetary policy in a lot of ways, which Bitcoin is in a sense. But Bitcoin's the best of two worlds in a lot of ways because it has like hard-baked monetary policy, but it can't be changed, and it's all just dictated by code and algorithms. Like if Menger was around these days, like he'd be a Bitcoin advocate in my opinion. He'd love Bitcoin. Like, I think he'd think it's the best thing ever. And like what you said earlier about Milton Friedman, I think he'd love Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is what he was kind of edging towards when he was talking about moving towards a decentralized digital currency. And as well, like Hayek as well, he also talked about there being, he didn't particularly mention digital currency, but he said there would definitely be a private currency that, I think paraphrasing him a lot right now, but that has some weird roundabout way of circumventing central banks and getting around the government, which that weird way I think is decentralization and that whole censorship resistance and immutability, because government doesn't really know how to deal with that. They can't really deal with it. Because I don't think Hayek ever believed that you could have like companies privately issue currencies, because he'd just be like, oh no, the central banks and the government will just shut it down. Whereas Bitcoin's like the sly roundabout way, which Hayek talked about in his like denationalization of money. Actually, I think he just talked about it in an interview. Actually, I'm not really sure if he mentioned that in his book, but Bitcoin definitely falls into what he was talking about then. So Hayek would have been a big fan of Bitcoin as well. But going back, like the monetary theories of Menger, monetary theories of Mises as well, Hayek too, all fall in the line of what makes a good, hard, sound money. Salableness is something Menger really coined as being a good property of hard, sound money, which Bitcoin is very salable. Mises talked a lot about sound money and how it should be free from state control and should be decentralized, and individuals should be the one who privatize the money supply and have private currencies that governments don't dictate, because that leads to bad monetary policy, which leads to things like GFC and all that kind of crap that we've experienced. But yeah, like it also just stems from a very because Bitcoin is so similar to gold, and so many like libertarian Austrian economics individuals are big gold bugs. Bitcoin just made a lot of sense to them, I think, in the early days. So they were the first adopters, like you said, with Max Kaiser and yourself. Like you probably came across Bitcoin because you would have been in the same circles of people that were talking about gold, and then people were talking about gold understand the value proposition of Bitcoin because they understand the Austrian economics behind why gold is valuable and why it's like a hard, sound money. So it all kind of like ties in and in that kind of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, so that leads me on to the final question I have here, and that is, where do you see Bitcoin in the future? Central bank of central banks?
Yeah, well, like I wouldn't call it a central bank. So that book I was talking about earlier on, The Safety and Most Austrian Economists, the Bitcoin Standard, the catchphrase on it is a decentralized digital alternative to central banking. I think I might have paraphrased that a bit, but pretty much that's what he looks at Bitcoin. And he looks at it as that every individual in the network, or at least businesses who operate in the network, are, in a sense, a central bank. Like they act as their own central bank in a sense. So Bitcoin isn't really a central bank. Every operator in the network of Bitcoin is their own central bank, and they govern the monetary policy and dictate the network to some capacity, like in a democratic way. So I wouldn't call it.
Do you know who Blythe Masters is?
No.
She's the woman. She was known as the pretty much the Wolf of Wall Street. She was like known as the Queen of Wall Street for a long time, and she invented something called the credit default swap. And she was J.P. Morgan's, so J.B. Diamond's right hand woman for a long time. She was basically the shadow master behind J.P. Morgan, and she quit J.P. Morgan in 2012 to go and chase after and startups, which were Bitcoin startups, and Jamie Dimon basically, he sort of got caught working with her in a way on this, calling it sort of a central bank, a way to coordinate central bank policy and stuff. It's kind of interesting. But it's kind of a little joke on Jamie Dimon and Blythe Masters. That's why I said that.
Yeah, well, they were pretty skeptical of Bitcoin when it started getting quite mainstream attention, like 4 years ago.
But Blythe Masters, if you want a bit of conspiracy, Blythe Masters is the one to look at. She's the one who got JP Morgan way ahead on the ball on all of this because she quit. And yeah, I'll throw you some more info on that when we finish the chat. But yeah, Blythe Masters is the big one, and all these other banks were left in the cold because of her. But sorry, go on. So where do you see Bitcoin in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with the credit default swaps with like the whole GFC and stuff like that. But I haven't really looked into Blythe, to be honest. But that's interesting. I'll check that out. In the future, well, I guess it could be a decentralized alternative to central banking. I think it's an interesting financial climate right now for stuff like Bitcoin and gold as well. Watching the global financial markets and all the central banks like stockpiling gold in the last year or so, I think that's the biggest buying of gold they've done since like 1971 when Nixon abolished the gold standard. Which these are, like, I'm not an economist or a financial analyst, but these are definitely like pretty obvious big indicators that there's something bad coming, which is probably stemming from the GFC and all the crappy monetary and fiscal policy that got enacted after the GFC, like all the quantitative easing. Now we've got all the big move towards negative interest rates globally. A lot of talk, like particularly in Australia, like in our context, there's a lot of people talking about this whole ban on cash, and they want to do the 10 grand cash limit, and they want to move down to 5 and then 2 supposedly. A lot of people like talking about that because the Australian government wants to start, or because they did start cutting interest rates quite recently actually. They want to start moving towards potentially low, zero, and negative interest rates, which if you have a fully digital economy, negative interest rates presumably work a lot better. It's easier to govern money if it's all digital and it's all in banks and stuff like that, which America's kind of trying to do the same thing as well, but they're a bit more complicated to ban cash across the board because it's a bit different there. But yeah, it's interesting with like all this stuff happening. Like people a lot smarter than me have been talking about a potential for a big recession upcoming. I don't know what you think about that. You might have more. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well,
I do think there's a depression coming, but it's correlated with demographic decline. So the same way Abe economics, this sort of stagnation in Japan happened after their sort of demographic collapse. That's what's coming, and it's correlated with the baby boomers. So my assumption is that just simply the more baby boomers that die, the closer we get to a collapse, because that impacts the housing market, which impacts consumption and everything else. And there's not enough generationally, Gen X or whatever it's called, the one in the middle of the millennials and the baby boomers is just not large enough to make up for the baby boomers. But the millennials are, but the problem is they're all debt saturated, and their incomes aren't going to move up for another 10, 15 years yet. So, and they're a big enough group of people, plus immigration in the United States, so that they can move up and take over that consumer base after the baby boomers have left what that's coming in that wake. But in the short term, you end up with a whole bunch of pain correlated with demographic demise, and that's a global phenomenon. So yes, there's a lot of pain coming. Yes, it's correlated to demographics. It's going to hit the markets. It's going to hit real estate. It's going to hit bonds. It's going to hit everything. It's the bond apocalypse. It's going to hit all of it. It's correlated with demographics, and so but you've got to hang on and you've got to see what happens. America will come out the best on the other side of that because they have the largest consumer base. They have the best. They're in the best position globally, and they have a big enough military to go back to Fortress America, and be fine. So America's dominance as a superpower is secured, but in the short term, you can end up with a lot of pain globally, and anarchy, geopolitical anarchy will pick up as America pulls back, especially with it now arguing it's in an isolationist mode, both the Democrats and the Republicans. So global anarchy will pick up, but that won't mean anything for America's domestic market. So America is pretty much safe. Like, you can put America in your safe basket, give or take a few different years of hardship between, maybe 10 years of pain. It'll probably end up being a 25-year depression, something like that, but that's a blimp in terms of total depressions that have happened globally. So yeah, until that demographic age gap and all those wages shift over, that's my opinion. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah, interesting perspective. No, I haven't thought about the baby boomers all dying off and all that, how that's going to impact the markets. But yeah, that's interesting. But I guess going back to Bitcoin. Just with the, like, as you said, like a potential of depression upcoming, I think that definitely leads to increased interest in alternative forms of money, particularly like gold, stores of value as well, Bitcoin. But in 10 years or so, like, it's hard to say. I'm not really someone who likes to kind of make predictions, but I could definitely see.
Give it a go.
It's not financial advice, but I could definitely see like one Bitcoin consuming good chunks of the real estate market, fine luxury art market, other luxury exotic goods, maybe a good chunk of gold market potentially, which could lead to it having a anywhere from 10 to 50 trillion market cap, which would price one Bitcoin at like upwards of $500,000 for a Bitcoin. But the prediction, big call, but
well, the prediction has been for a long time $1 million a coin, probably.
Yeah. So that's about it. Yeah, it's about 100 trillion market cap, which, like, if it absorbed like 10% of real estate, 10% of fine art, 10% of gold, like it'd be close to that range. So I think it's definitely got a place like in the world. But I think Bitcoin is going to be one of them things that it's an all or nothing. Like, I think it's either going to be like that $1 million Bitcoin, or it's going to be dead.
Well, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting because the internet itself is an all or nothing thing, but because it's decentralized and because it was built out of the shadow of the Cold War to survive on its own. If there was ever a nuclear attack, it would just keep sort of spreading like a virus. It seems to have done well. I mean, you shut off a whole country's like North Korea's not being connected to the internet hasn't impacted the internet one iota. Doesn't even matter.
Yep.
No one even noticed that the North Koreans aren't on the net. There's 1 billion people in China, 1.3 something billion people in China. They're not on the internet as we know it. It doesn't impact the internet at all. Internet functions perfectly fine. And if America went off the internet tomorrow, we would all lose some Facebook and some stuff, but it doesn't matter. The internet would just grow around it. There's an internet there in America, and there's an internet there in China. I mean, Bitcoin is essentially the same. It's just going to keep growing around the pressures that confront it.
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant thing about these distributed networks like Tor, the internet, file sharing, torrenting. Like, look at the efforts that's another thing that I wouldn't mind just touching on real quickly is like the potential death of Bitcoin, people think that like governments will just ban it around the world, which I think in a lot of circumstances it's not very practical. For one, you can look at history for examples of where it didn't really work, trying to ban distributed systems, like with like LimeWire and Napster and stuff like that. Like Napster got shut down because it had a company behind it, but the IPFS stuff that made it operate, like the protocol, which that's all Bitcoin is, it's a protocol. You can't shut that down, you can't ban it. Say like Australia tried to ban it, it opens up other opportunities for other nations. Like it's a bit of a hard thing to coordinate, and there's no central body you can attack and ban and shut down like you can with this LIVERA currency, like the government's trying to do in America. But it's interesting.
That's a good point, because the LIVERA currency, what it does is actually benefits the government in the fact that they could ban Facebook on banning LIVERA, and because it's tied in, that's how they can get rid of Facebook if they ever wanted to, by saying they're banning LIVERA, and there's nothing Facebook could do about that unless they said, ban our LIVERA division, but they would say, oh no, it's all the proceeds of crime now. We're confiscating the whole company. It could actually be the Facebook killer.
Yeah, well, I know the government has they want to break apart Facebook. It's going to be interesting in the 2020 election, like how much this digital currency narrative and stuff is talked about. And I'm hoping Bitcoin gets talked about a little bit in there as well. That'd be good.
Trump's tweeting about it. He doesn't like it. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't like it. He doesn't
tweeted about it, though.
Yeah.
Well, it's not good. Well, Trump doesn't like it, so presumably a lot of Republicans don't like it. Democrats don't like Facebook, so they probably don't like digital currencies because Facebook's trying to do it. Because they're the one they want to break up. Or
the Fed doesn't like it, obviously.
Fed doesn't like it, yeah. But it's interesting. I went to a talk last night with a Harvard professor. He's an old school Bitcoin guy. He studies cryptocurrencies and stuff. Like he published a paper in like 2012, so he's been around a long time. And he's got a law degree. He's at Harvard and computer science and economics and that kind of stuff. His name's David Yermak, if anyone wants to look him up. But I was at a talk with him actually last night in Perth, where I'm from. He was over for a conference, and he was talking about I don't know much about US law, but he was saying that in America it's actually against antitrust laws for the government to ban LIVERA. I presume he's right. He's the Harvard lawyer and that, but he said that although supposedly it's not entirely illegal, it's a bit complicated. Entirely legal to issue your own private currencies. There's obviously restrictions to that, and there is not everyone can just go issue a currency, but there's obviously there's guidance and laws and ways you have to do it and stuff like that. But he said it's going to be very interesting in how the Senate hearings proceed over the next 6 or so months with LIVERA, with the US government, because it's pretty much like this government saying they have a monopoly on money and you're not allowed to do it, which imagine if they did that in another industry.
Everybody freaks out because the US dollar is eventually going to crash and it's going to become zero. But what that means in practicality, there's going to be a lot of riots and there'll be all this sort of stuff going on, but wars even. But really, what it means is a bunch of guys they sit around in a fancy room somewhere. They mint out a new central currency. And they back it by something, either by gold, by silver, combination, Bitcoin, standard drawing right, whatever you want. And that's it. And then everybody just goes on and starts using that again. They just rebuy that currency and the whole world rolls on. But Bitcoin will the standard drawing right, yes, over at the IMF, World Bank, Bank of International Settlements, but I think Bitcoin might be in that mix. What do you reckon? When the US dollar collapses, do you think they'll run to Bitcoin?
Yeah, it depends what stage of Bitcoin's development it's at when that happens. I think that's definitely a big factor of if that would occur. If it happened like right now today, no.
Yeah, I agree.
Still got a lot of creases to work out. But maybe if I say it happened in like 10 years where Bitcoin's a lot more evolved and maybe the volatility is like very minimal, and it's at that level where it's like, as I was saying earlier, like that medium exchange level where people are okay to spend it because it's not going to raise in price too much over the next few days or whatever. maybe then in that period of time they would use something like Bitcoin. I could see Facebook using Bitcoin in their basket of goods because they want to have a basket of goods to back up their LIVERA. I can definitely see them using Bitcoin once the volatility kind of decreases, which it is. So,
Do you ever see the central banks and the governments might add Bitcoin to their reserves? So, so for example, Russia and China are always battling against the US dollar. Maybe they'll buy $100 billion worth of Bitcoin to add to their reserves, which would force the price up immensely. But now they would have Bitcoin-backed ruble or Bitcoin-backed yuan in their arsenal.
I think so. I think it'd be like what you said before, but maybe within a basket of other goods. But yeah, it would because if Bitcoin gets like wide mainstream adoption and individuals use it, government's just going to have to go with what's getting used like by their people, and like they can't really stop it. They can't really stop their citizens from using it. If everyone just started using it and it was a pretty widely used store of value, medium of exchange, I think they would have to. Like I think that I don't know if they would want to. I don't know if I think they'd just be like, well, it's kind of the way it is, and Bitcoin's money now, I guess, and we need to use it to back up our federally issued currencies if they even still exist, with the likes of LIVERA and stuff like that. But
you mentioned,
I'm sure they will. But. You
mentioned Silk Road in these dark markets before. The FBI, I'm pretty sure, was the one that raided those and took all those Bitcoin wallets, and now the FBI is all chunked up with Bitcoin. Do you think that that's going to become a common theme? The government wants Bitcoin. It just raids people's wallets.
Well, they actually sold. I think they actually sold all the Bitcoin they had. The FBI, they sold them at auction. I think Tim Draper. I think he bought a good chunk of the Bitcoins after the Silk Road shut down. The FBI auctioned them off. But yeah,
well, that was silly, wasn't it?
Like, as I was saying, yeah. Well, Tim Draper's a massive Bitcoin advocate. He runs funds and stuff now for it, and he's travels around the world and tries to get hedge funds and family funds on board with it and educates people about it. He's great. Like, he's good. He's a good guy to give all that Bitcoin to. But yeah, I can see the government getting behind it. Like as I said before, like if it gets big, like the social consensus will just be so huge that the government just have to. I think. Like they won't have a choice really. Like I don't know if they're like sitting around thinking now, like planning into their future plans, but yeah, definitely if it gets big, which will just organically happen over time, they'll have to take notice.
So we're running out of time. So would you like to tell anybody anything about yourself or your Bitcoin experience, or you said you wanted to do some events in Perth, or would you like to make any announcements or tell people? Have you got a book? I don't know.
No, I don't have a book. Oh yeah, I guess like I should post a lot on Twitter about Bitcoin. You can follow me on Twitter. I got it to @Ben_Sharp_.
I'll leave that in the description.
Happy to talk to anyone about Bitcoin. I'd say getting into this space, learn about money first, the economics of it, and get into the technical side of Bitcoin. And then if you want, like look into other projects. I still look at like blockchain projects and stuff like that, even though I think a large majority of them are not fit for purpose. A lot of them are scams. Well, it's a fact that a large portion of projects are just blatant scams. A lot of lawsuits actually going on in Australia at the moment, and in America and a few other countries. But yeah, like I'd personally stick with Bitcoin in my personal opinion, because I went through a small period like in 2016, 2017, where I was kind of into all these other projects. I thought they had potential, and I kind of bought into the hype a bit, and it took me like a year or so to kind of unlearn all that stuff and go back to my roots of liking Bitcoin, which definitely, I guess, started with, reading things like the Bitcoin Standard by that Safety Namoose who I mentioned. If people are into podcasts, there's a guy in Sydney, STEPHAN LIVERA. You probably know him actually still. You know STEPHAN LIVERA? He talked to Friedman and stuff a few times.
Oh yeah, well then I would know him, yeah.
Yeah, well, he runs he's an accountant, but I don't think he's an accountant anymore. He's pretty much life's Bitcoin now, and he runs one of the most, I guess, prominent Bitcoin podcasts, and its primary focus is on the Austrian economics of Bitcoin, and he gets Austrian economists on who like Bitcoin, who don't like it. He gets developers on, like technical people on work on the code side of Bitcoin. So it's an amazing podcast. It's just called the STEPHAN LIVERA podcast. I'd highly recommend that and the Safety to Moose book when you start your Bitcoin journey, and then get into the monetary theory with like Menger and Mises and Hayek and all the good old school classical Austrian economists. And yeah, I guess that's all I really offer. Oh, and as well, what you said about I haven't really got anything in stone, but I'll likely be hosting workshops in Perth in the next coming months. I've still got to like flesh out and plan it all, and it's just something I've kind of drafted up, and I will be doing it, but in the next few months. Quite a lot of them for free, but
keep me abreast of that development, because I'd love to Detonation to sponsor that if I could.
Yeah, well, it's going to just be like primary focus, like doing basic workshops to start, teaching people about money, teach people about Bitcoin, mostly Bitcoin, because money is not really my expertise so much, but just a bit of both. It's probably pretty introductory workshops, as well as doing them for businesses. So like, I don't know, for example, if you're a law firm and you deal with legal cases relating to Bitcoin, which there is a lot of crime that occurs with Bitcoin, and you've got a firm that has no idea about Bitcoin, like I guess I could offer a service where I could give them some advice, consult with them, and teach them about how to best go about things. So that's kind of where I'd go with like phase 2, I guess, doing some consulting type things, if the workshops and that get some traction here in Perth. Perth's quite small, so I don't know how many Bitcoin people we got here, but hopefully heaps.
Yeah, let's see. I have to see the size of the community. I mean, as I said, Dead Nation would be happy to sponsor something like that. Help you out there, cool. because I think it's a great endeavor. That's really cool. So thank you very much for coming on Dead Nation and talking to us about Bitcoin. It's been really great. It's been really energizing. It's been really exciting. It's good to get refreshed. I've been battling on many fronts. I left the Bitcoin thing for a little while now. It's just nice to return to all that sort of stuff, because I've been battling on so many other fronts. But it's really nice and refreshing to come back and hear that everything is going smoothly, I guess. I really want to go, if I ever go overseas again, I want to go to places like Iceland and the colder regions, Canada and all that, where all these big Bitcoin miners are based in the cold areas, and check out their mining operations, because they look really cool.
Yeah, definitely. Like, thanks so much as well, just quickly about the offering for the sponsorship. That'd be a big help. And yeah, thanks for having me on. That was great. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, everyone, if you want to read some shit posts about Bitcoin.
No, thank you.
It's very the crypto or Bitcoin community is very it's a lot of crap talking, a lot of fighting, a lot of bickering, which is exciting. It's fun, getting a lot of heated discussions with people online. So also I do just quickly, I just remembered I host a Bitcoin only Perth meetup. So we only talk about Bitcoin. We talk about other coins in the context of Bitcoin. But I have my first meetup actually tomorrow night at 6 o'clock at Outback Jack's in the city. So you can have some steaks and have some beer and talk about Bitcoin. So
awesome.
Should be fun.
If
anyone's
really,
in Perth.
Yeah, if anyone's in Perth. Oh, I was going to say as well, they put Chris Berg on the stage all the time. I reckon it's time to see some Ben Sharp on the stage, by the way. I'm not at Chris's level of expertise when it comes to the economic arguments so much, but I'm getting there. I'll be there soon enough. But yeah, maybe if you do this little meetup thing, and maybe if you pump out a bit of a pamphlet, maybe they'll because you have a fantastic knowledge. I mean, I want to get Chris Berg on here as well. Cheers. But I think it's time for some Bitcoin only Bitcoin bull to be on the stage.
Yeah. Well, like this, I'm surprised there wasn't more people like that in the libertarian community. I thought it would be very pro Bitcoin. But Chris is great. I enjoy having discussions with Chris. Like, he's more of a blockchain guy. He likes Bitcoin, but
there's a lot of these. So that's another thing. Thanks for coming on and talking Bitcoin with me, and not just blockchain. Yeah, no worries. Anytime. Always happy to talk Bitcoin. All right, thank you so much, Ben Sharp. That's it. Unshackled.net. Get on there. Look at all the news that's going on over there on the Unshackled.net, and I'll get more back onto the audience about all this craziness that's happening in with the. Cause did you know that just before we went to air, the America labeled China as a currency manipulator?
Yeah, no, I did see that actually.
Yeah.
Reading it on my computer actually when you were setting up the sound before. So
that is huge news.
Yeah.
That is huge news. So we'll have to see. To see what that does. The Dow collapsed. Everything's collapsing. I'm watching it now.
Yeah. Wow.
All right.
Jeez.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Steele. See you later.